for coming to our distinguished lecture series. It's great to see full room. Reminds me of pre-COVID days. It's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Tim Roughgarden. Tim is a professor of computer science at Columbia University, where he's been since 2019. Prior to that, he was a professor at Stanford for 15 years, and prior to that, postdoc at Berkeley, and he holds a PhD from Cornell. He also is running a research lab at A16Z Crypto, which is a VC firm investing in crypto and Web3. So Tim is very well known for his contributions at the intersection of economics and computer science, primarily in the field of algorithmic game theory. I'll just name one of his main well-known contributions. He and Eva Tardosh from Cornell University have well-known results on price of anarchy of selfish routing in traffic and communication networks. So these are essentially results quantifying the societal cost of finding equilibria in absence of a central authority. And just for this results and this work alone, he's been given many awards, but I promised him that I won't mention them to keep the introduction short. He's also very well known as an educator to the broader CS community on algorithms. He runs some of the most popular online courses, and he's authored several books, such as the Algorithms Illuminated book series. And my connection to Tim as his host is not through research, but through him as an educator. I happened to take, in my first term in grad school at Stanford, a course by him called Beyond Worst Case Analysis of Algorithms, and then later set in another one of his courses. And although these courses didn't really have much connection to the research that I was doing, they were still very important for me for two reasons. One, as you'll see today, Tim is an excellent lecturer, and it was in these lectures that I really understood the importance of delivering good lectures consistently to increase the curiosity of students, even who were not in your field. And two, it was the first time I took advanced theory courses in my own education, and I had a deep math phobia coming to the course. And Tim had a way of explaining the theorems and proofs and all the complex math by showing us that, behind all that math, at the center, there's always some very strong intuition or something very interpretable that really helped me break my math phobia, that I actually ended up taking 3 additional advanced theory courses in the rest of my education. So, even though I don't do much theoretical work, to this day I do maintain a deep appreciation of theory and the role that it plays in non-theoretical fields like my field of data management. And today Tim is going to also tell us about the role that theory plays in crypto and Web3. And with that, let's give him a round of applause, please.
Thanks very much, Sammy. Thanks everyone for coming. Certainly one of the pleasures is sort of getting more senior is seeing your former students sort of go on and do great things. Sammy is a perfect example of that. Very happy to be back at Waterloo. Last time I was here was in fall 2012, giving the colloquium. It was a very memorable visit, in part because of the amazing faculty and students here that I talked to. In part because I was coming from New York, I was on sabbatical, and Hurricane Sandy hit while I was here. So I could not get back to New York, to my lower Manhattan apartment. At that time, I had my first date with my now wife. We were supposed to have our second date, that got postponed. Obviously, eventually we had it. And so I was kind of stuck in a hotel here in Waterloo, where it just so happened the World Series was on, and literally my favorite sports team of any sport, the San Francisco Giants, swept the Detroit Tigers 4-0 in the World Series. And so I kept calling back to my New York apartment. I was like, is the power back on? Is the power back on every day? And the answer was no. It took like 10 days. So I just flew out to San Francisco and went to the World Series parade. One day, they said, yes, the power's back on, and I flew back to New York, and that kind of closed the loop. So really never, hopefully there's a little less sort of drama on this trip. Never forget that one. I wanted to talk a little bit today about blockchain protocols and the applications being built on top of them. That technology stack is sometimes called Web3. Goals for today, very modest. Really just want to convince you all that there's some super cool computer science that's making this technology possible. Obviously I'm biased as a theoretician, but I believe whenever there's super cool computer science, theory is probably playing a very fundamental role. And indeed, if you know how to look for them, you can see theoretical computer scientists' fingerprints all over this application domain. Okay, so that's what I want to talk about. I thought it might be instructive to actually start with a more sort of high-level discussion. Because I got to tell you, in my 25 years as a computer scientist, I've really never seen a technology that's so widely misunderstood as blockchains and their applications. I think it's partly kind of a testament to the power of first impressions. So when the Bitcoin protocol came out in 2009, there's sort of a lot of ideology around it, a lot of opinions got hardened in the years that followed. And some of the criticisms of that time, I think, were at least semi-accurate 8 to 10 years ago. But they're very much out of date now. So there's been many, many generations of blockchain protocols that have come after Bitcoin. There's also been tremendous evolution in our understanding of what this technology might be able to achieve. So I thought I'd start just by trying to take an honest look at this technology now, in 2023, and look at it not through the lens of money or investment or politics, but really just through the lens of my discipline, computer science. And I want to tell you what I see when I look at this technology stack through that lens. I like to organize the discussion in terms of the what, the how, and the why. For the what question, I want to distill what is the essential functionality of the technology. What does it let you do that you couldn't do before? Okay? I almost want to think about blockchains as like a computational model and ask about the power of that computational model. So I'm going to make you wait, and I'm going to give you my answer to the what question for blockchains and Web3 on the next slide. But for a running analogy, let's talk about the internet. So you could ask the what question for the internet. What's its essential functionality? You could argue about that, but let's agree that it enables the near instantaneous transmission of digital data between any 2 points on the globe. I think most people would roughly agree that that's fundamentally what the internet does. Okay? And one thing to notice is that the what question, if you think about a technology stack with the lowest level stuff on the bottom and user-facing applications on top, the what question is squarely in the middle of this stack. It's where the rubber meets the road, where whatever system you're building meets the applications that are built on top of that system. The how and the why questions then concern the bottom and the top of that stack, respectively. Because it's all fine to sort of write down a cool answer to the what question, right? But there's still, it's like, okay, is that actually realizable? Can you build a system fulfilling the promises of that functionality with today's technology? And if so, how would you do it? You could again ask that question about the internet, right, which we all take for granted, right, in 2023. But if you stop and think about it, right, enable the near instantaneous transmission of digital data between any 2 points on the globe, it's pretty amazing, right? And so you'd be right to ask, like, how on earth could anyone build such a thing? And the answer, of course, in addition to a lot of time and economic investment, has been a lot of super cool computer science. And all of you who take computer networking here at Waterloo, you learn about stuff like BGP routing, TCP congestion control, all kinds of great computer science ideas that were important for the build-out of the internet. For blockchains and Web3, honestly, the answer to the how question is going to be basically the same. Okay, it's going to be basically a bunch of super cool computer science, which is what I'm going to focus on in my talk today. I'm going to focus not on the why question. The why question says, okay, it's all fine and good to write down some sort of computational functionality. Maybe you can even realize that functionality. But then there's also the question, like, why would anyone want that? What does that let you do that's helpful to anybody? You could ask the why question about the internet. And in 2023, you could walk up to literally anybody on the street, and they could give you a zillion answers to the why question. Maybe they talk about YouTube, or TikTok, or social media, or online dating, or Wikipedia, right? Whatever. Everybody's going to have some great answers to the why question. Okay? Now, on the blockchain side, there's two reasons why I'm not going to talk much about the why question today, although I'm happy to in the Q&A. I'm glad we have a lot of time for Q&A, and I'm happy to use that. The first is that I do basic sort of core computer science research. So as far as my research, it tends to be, it's not entirely, but it tends to be more about the how question, so that's natural for me to focus on here. For the second reason, going back to the internet, right? 2023, everybody knows why it's interesting. First version of the internet, the ARPANET, rolled out around 1969. So that would be 54 years ago. It's instructive to think about the midpoint of that interval, 27 years ago in 1996, okay? So I was a junior in college at the time, And so I used the internet such as it was. And to be clear, what using the internet meant for me in 1996 is I would go into a special room in the basement of my dorm. I would sit down at a Macintosh LC580 with an Ethernet cable sticking out the back. I would log into my email to check if I'd gotten any in the previous 24 hours. The answer was actually usually no, believe it or not. So these days, like, I've heard of people spending thousands of dollars to go into digital detox programs, but really, in 1996, if you wanted to go offline, just get out of the basement. What's the point? That was 27 years in to the internet. 27 years in. It's not that there weren't applications. You could send email, you could transfer files. As of very recently, you had Web 1. You could render static web pages in a browser, like Mosaic or Netscape. But if you think about all the answers that that person on the street gave us in 2023 about why the internet is interesting, YouTube, TikTok, Wikipedia, online dating, social media, none of it has been built yet. None of it. Okay? So the second reason I'm not going to talk much about the why question for blockchains, it's not that there aren't applications. Okay, there are. Again, I'm happy to elaborate on that in the Q&A. Just like there were applications of the internet in 1996, it's that my prediction is that those applications will get much, much more interesting as the years go on, just as they did with the internet. Okay. So I still owe you a promise. What is the what of blockchains? What functionality do they do fundamentally? And a couple caveats. So first of all, when I say here blockchain protocol, I'm going to mean a general purpose smart contract platform, Ethereum being the best known one, but there's also many others. Secondly, just to be clear, I'm not saying that what's on this slide is literally true. I'm saying this is my recommendation about how to have a mental model for this technology, the engineering challenges that might come up in trying to build it, and the types of applications that it's going to enable. Foremost, think about a blockchain protocol as a computer, okay? The same way your laptop is a computer. Not like a physically realized computer, okay? It's going to be sort of a virtual machine that runs in the sky, but a general purpose computer nonetheless. Okay? That by itself doesn't sound that interesting, right? You probably have a pretty powerful computer on your wrist. And this, if you think of blockchain protocols as a computer, it's a computer with the power of one from several decades ago. So what's the rest of the story? It's a very peculiar computer in that it, in effect, has no owner, no operator. No one's able to shut it down, in the same way no one's able to really shut down the internet. Okay? You can think of it again as kind of a virtual machine running in the sky, in plain view, kind of as a public good. The computer is open access. Okay? There may be a usage fee, especially in times of congestion, but like you don't need anyone's permission. You don't need to be on some whitelist. You don't need any credentials. Anyone can use this computer, by which I mean interact with already installed software, smart contracts, or deploy your own. Finally, once you include cryptography into the picture, despite in effect having no owner itself, this computer enables a meaningful notion of ownership by its end users. As a user of a blockchain protocol, like for example Ethereum, you can own in a meaningful sense, you can have in effect private property, okay, which is stored by this computer in the sky. And that really fundamentally is the paradox that Nakamoto managed to resolve in with the Bitcoin protocol. How do you have a computer that in some sense has no owner itself, yet enables this meaningful notion of ownership for digital data stored on that computer? Okay. Nakamoto was clearly interested in the specific use case of cryptocurrencies and tracking ownership of Bitcoin. That is not the fundamental contribution of the technology. The fundamental contribution of the technology is enabling meaningful ownership of digital data. Okay. And I would argue that this combination of properties I would not know how to achieve prior to the advent of blockchain technology. In that sense, this new computing functionality gives us the ability to do things that we couldn't do. So let me get into the meat of the talk. I've optimized the talk for breadth over depth. So I want to talk about three different things, very deliberately drawn from totally different parts of theoretical computer science. We'll talk about algorithmic mechanism design. We'll talk about distributed computing. We'll talk about proof systems. I just wanted to illustrate, and this is not an exhaustive list, but I wanted to give you a sense of the many points of contact between computer science and specifically theoretical computer science and what's happening with this technology. So let's start by talking about transaction fee mechanism design. So let me just tell you a little bit more. Probably most of you know this, but just a little bit more about how blockchains work so I can tell you what a transaction fee mechanism is. So as we discussed, fundamentally a blockchain protocol is simulating some virtual machine. Okay? And so really what's happening is it's generating and confirming this sort of endlessly sort of running sequence of transactions. If you want, think of a transaction as sort of a payment from Alice to Bob. I would actually encourage you to think of a transaction as like a little snippet of code in assembly language. Okay, so a list of transactions is just a long list of assembly language instructions, which are all being carried out by this virtual machine in the sky. Okay? Now, new transactions are added to this running log in batches, which are called blocks. And what matters for us right now is that blocks only come along every so often, and they can only be only so big. So using Ethereum as an example, you get a new block, a new batch every 12 seconds, and a typical block might have something like, say, 200 transactions in it. Okay, so you're going to get something like, I don't know, 15 transactions per second. And so when I said these computers were sort of only as powerful as computers from several decades ago, that's what I meant. Okay? So that means computation in, for example, the Ethereum virtual machine is a scarce resource. Okay? Many more than 15 transactions per second would like to be executed by that virtual machine. There is not room for them all. So no matter how altruistic you may be, you have to pick winners and losers, transactions that get in, transactions that don't. Okay? And if we're taking seriously this metaphor of the computer in the sky as a public good, well then we want to basically saturate the supply, and we want to do it with the most valuable transactions. And that is the role of a transaction fee mechanism. Identify the most valuable transactions so that they can be the ones that get to use the scarce resource. All right, so let me tell you about sort of the original transaction fee mechanism. This is still used in Bitcoin to this day. It was used by Ethereum until a little under 2 years ago, called the first price auction. So you can't really expect a blockchain protocol to know which transactions are valuable and which ones aren't. So you're going to ask users to include a bid, okay, an amount that they're willing to pay for their transaction to be executed. Okay? Now, at this point you might have a question, just like, but I thought this computer like had no owner. So who is this user paying its transaction fee to exactly? So let me unpack things a little bit more to explain. So what I mean by ownerless is a no operator. I really mean that there's lots of physical machines, ideally thousands of physical machines scattered all over the globe, all cooperating, all staying in sync on the current state of this virtual machine, okay, that they're all simulating. So all of these thousands of machines running the blockchain protocol, they're cooperating to keep track of the past. Interestingly, in the biggest blockchain protocols, the present is not cooperative. The present is a unilateral sort of decision by one of these thousands of nodes. Which one? Well, think of it as chosen at random. Okay? Because of various things, you need something called Sybil resistance. So if you've heard of proof of work or proof of stake, that's kind of how you do the random sampling. Don't worry about it. Okay, one node out of the thousands is chosen at random. The next 200 transactions, the next block, is under unilateral control of that one chosen node. Knowing that, seems obvious where the transaction fee should go to. If your transaction gets executed, it's because it belonged to some block. That block had a unique creator. Presumably that creator who chose your transaction rather than others, they're the ones who should be getting your payment. Okay? So that's the first price auction. Users submit transactions with bids, block producers assemble blocks, and you get the transaction fees from all of the transactions you include in your block. Okay? So that was the status quo. If you studied a little bit of game theory or auction theory, you know that it's actually kind of non-trivial to bid in first price auctions. Okay? Because you kind of have to reason about your competition, right? Like you want your transaction to get in, you want to pay as little as possible, so you want to pay the minimum amount so that you beat out your competition. So you have to think about, okay, but what are they bidding at? Okay? And that's a non-trivial problem. So bidding on first price auctions, they've long been known to be sort of hard to reason about. It's been true for 50 years, and the blockchain setting doesn't make it any easier. And so the question that motivates this what we're going to talk about now is, could you have a transaction fee mechanism which is better What does better mean? It can mean a lot of things, but let's say it's easier for the users to figure out how to bid. The gold standard here would be what's sometimes called a truthful mechanism. If you've ever heard of a second price auction or a Vickrey auction, all you have to do is figure out your maximum willingness to pay, you submit that as your bid, and it's a dominant strategy. You do not care what the competition is. It doesn't matter, you're guaranteed that your truthful bid is going to be on. So you get asked, is there a truthful transaction fee mechanism? Okay. So before I start answering that, a couple comments about why this is sort of such a fun topic to talk about. Reason number one is that this seems like it should be sort of a well-solved problem. Okay? Indeed, if you look at lecture 4 of my 20 lectures in Algorithmic Game Theory book, it seems to have a solution to exactly this problem in the form of the truthful knapsack auction. But it turns out, and we'll be precise about this, the blockchain setting imposes some idiosyncratic constraints, which make it impossible to just copy and paste the known solutions to be a solution here. Okay? So even though it's a super basic sort of scarce resource allocation problem, we have to think about it in a new way because of the new application domain. Second reason this topic is really fun to think about is I want to emphasize, so this is mechanism design, and it's mechanism design kind of in the guts of a blockchain protocol. We're literally talking about the code, for example, for the Ethereum protocol itself. Okay? Now, like the internet, okay, there's an application layer in Web3. There are applications that are built on top of blockchains. Just like in the application layer of the internet, of course, there's applications for mechanism design and market design. Right? Whenever you have like a two-sided platform, there's a market design problem to ask. Obviously, you'd expect to have those same opportunities over in sort of Web3. But this is not about the applications. This is about how the thing actually works. This is like doing mechanism design for BGP routing or TCP congestion control, an opportunity that nobody had back in the 70s and 80s when you just didn't have computer scientists who were thinking about incentives and economics. Here, not only does the community exist, but also the community is well known to people actually building out major blockchain protocols, and we have an opportunity to influence how they work. Okay, so we can look back 25 years from now, we'll be able to point, potentially, to specific things about dominant blockchain protocols that came out of the research community. Okay, and again, in the infrastructure, in their plumbing, not at the application layer. So that's also very exciting. So getting back to the question, is there a better transaction fee mechanism? I mean, hopefully that strikes you as a reasonably natural question to ask. At the time I did this work, which was in 2020, it was also a very timely question, specifically for the Ethereum blockchain, okay? Why? Well, at that time, in 2020, they were using a first price auction, the mechanism I already told you about. They were contemplating switching to a new mechanism, which I will tell you about shortly. And it was a very polarizing proposal. We can talk in the Q&A why it was polarizing if you like. The point is, there was this sort of, there was a big controversy over whether the Ethereum protocol, as part of its next upgrade, should switch over to this new transaction fee mechanism. So Ethereum is known for its very strong community, for getting a high degree of social consensus before they make any major changes. And so, because of the controversy, so Tim Bykos, this again was in 2020, so Tim Bykos is a sort of major figure in the Ethereum community, and so he did just a community outreach survey. So he talked, for example, to people who run exchanges, he talks to people who do block production for a living, he talked to people who write software wallets, asked everybody about their thoughts on this new transaction fee mechanism. It's called EIP 1559, or EIP is Ethereum Improvement Proposal. Asked everybody how they felt about EIP 1559, and if they had any concerns, what could they as a community do to make them feel more comfortable with making that switch? And they mentioned multiple things, but what I want to highlight here is one of the biggest things mentioned was the lack of a formal specification or proof for the mechanism that people can independently evaluate and critique. And let me remind you, not a single respondent to this survey is someone who writes like peer-reviewed research papers. This was 100% people building things in the Ethereum ecosystem who cared about its future. And among that group, there was a visceral hunger for having a mathematical analysis of this mechanism, for really having algorithmic mechanism design. And there's no question that was sort of a big motivation for why I did this work. So I mentioned that you can't just copy-paste existing solutions, like sort of the second price auction and generalizations, if you've ever heard of the VCG mechanism, for example. So let me talk here about those additional constraints we have to deal with. The first challenge I've written is challenge 0, because this is not specific to the blockchain setting. This is just always sort of the challenge in mechanism design. You're trying to make a good decision, like allocate Ethereum block space efficiently. To do that, you need to know people's preferences, like how badly do they want the block space. And the issue is always you're concerned about participants misrepresenting their preferences to trick you into doing some decision that's beneficial for them. So that's the standard challenge, and we have standard vocabulary for talking about we want to be robust to that, being a truthful mechanism, or sometimes called a decent mechanism. So we're going to want that as usual. But there's a couple other challenges that are going to force us to define new incentive compatibility notions. Okay, so this is a traditional one. The other two are going to be new to this work. So first, remember, when we talked about first price auctions, I said, where does the transaction fee go? Okay. And we talked about how each batch of transactions is the unilateral decision of a single randomly chosen block producer. Okay? So what that means is you have to think about incentive compatibility. You have to think about the incentives not just for the users submitting transactions and submitting bids. You have to think about incentives for the block producers themselves. Okay? You can, if you want, sit in your armchair and write down some mechanism you would like the block producers to do. They can do whatever they want. Okay? They can ignore it. So you also have to come up with a transaction fee mechanism which is in the block producer's best interest. That's further complicated by the fact that block producers can easily manufacture fake transactions. And if you're wondering why you never hear about second price or Vickery auctions in a blockchain context, this is the #1 reason. Okay, because second price auctions, if you think about it, they're very easy to manipulate by shill bids. Right? So if the highest bidder is $10, and you're the person actually running the auction, you can make up a bid that's $9.99 to force them to basically pay their full bid. So in the presence of having sort of shill bids like you easily do in a blockchain context, second price auctions become first price auctions anyways. So that's going to be our first new one, MMIC. So it should be incentive compatible for the block producers themselves. Also, in the blockchain setting, you really need to worry about collusion to a degree that you traditionally don't in mechanism design settings. It's not that there isn't collusion in traditional settings. It's just that you kind of have stronger legal channels to deal with them. You usually don't deal with them inside the mechanism itself. You deal with them with a sort of separate enforcement procedure. Now, blockchain context, like the first issue is that there are smart contracts, which kind of make collusion even easier potentially. And then the second issue, again, is like the sort of reach of the rule of law is sort of not as strong in the blockchain context as in traditional applications. So we're worried about end users manipulating the mechanism. We're worried about block producers manipulating the mechanism. We're worried about cartels of users and block producers manipulating the mechanism. OCA proofness, that's going to be our second new incentive compatibility constraint, which says actually cartels can't manipulate the mechanism. I'm going to flash 2 slides that give formal definitions of these 2 new incentive compatibility guarantees. I'm only going to flash them because based on what I've told you already, they're the exact definitions that you yourself would write down. Okay? So MMIC, remember, this says you want it to be incentive compatible for the block producers, so it should be in the block producer's best interest, that is, it should maximize their transaction fee revenue by following your mechanism. Okay? And as we said, and that should be true even if block producers can inject fake transactions. As we said, the second price auction just completely fails this criterion. First price auctions, if you think about it, actually do satisfy this guarantee. Okay. So that's robustness to block producer manipulation. What about cartels? Well, again, it just says that if a bunch of users and a block producer get together, there should be no way that they can coordinate to increase their joint surplus, sort of the joint utility they get out of the blockchain protocol. Again, you don't have to see this in real time, but it turns out the first price auction is easily shown to satisfy OCA proofness. It's easy, like the real way to understand this definition is for me to tell you a non-example. Okay, so sort of design that you might want to copy paste out of a textbook, but it doesn't work because it can be manipulated by cartels. So imagine you wanted to use a reserve price, okay, which is sort of like a minimum bid that you're willing to consider. Okay, that's a natural thing that you would do in auction design. It turns out that will be badly manipulable by cartels. Right? Like imagine the protocol, in your mechanism, you try to set a reserve price at $10. And imagine that as it turned out, all of the users, potential users of the blockchain, no one was willing to pay more than $7 to get executed, right? So if the block producer just kind of follows the mechanism and sort of ignores all the bids that are 7, it's going to make no money at all. There's just going to be this empty block because no one's willing to pay the reserve price. But if they collude, right, then the block producer can say, hey everybody, I know you're only willing to pay 7, but just make sure you tell the protocol you're willing to pay 10, and I promise you I'll refund you 3 from a side channel, okay? Either through a smart contract or just through an off-chain payment. So through these side payments, you can evade any reserve price you try to lay down in the protocol. Okay, so the point here again is just the second incentive compatibility constraint is also ruling out traditional formats that we might want to use. It's ruling out this sort of idea of reserve price. All right, so I hope this gives you a feel for the mechanism design problem. Okay, we have three incentive compatibility notions. DSIC means not manipulable by end users through false bids. MMIC means not manipulable by block producers. OCA proof means not manipulable by coalitions. And obviously, we'd like a mechanism that satisfies all three. So the question is there one? Let's return to the EIP 1559. Let's return to the transaction fee mechanism that Ethereum was considering switching to. Let me tell you how it works. I did not design this mechanism. This mechanism was designed by Vitalik Buterin, founder of Ethereum and famously undergraduate at the University of Waterloo. I would say it has three big ideas, EIP 1559. Idea number one is to use a reserve price. But wait a minute, you say. Didn't I just make a big deal that you can't use a reserve price because it can be manipulated by cartels? Yes, I did. That was for the most straightforward use of a reserve price, where you do the obvious thing with the revenue of passing it on to the block producer, like you do with the first price auction. So instead, and basically to recover OCA proofness, any revenue that's generated by the reserve price is going to be burned. Burned meaning those coins, and this is part now of the Ethereum native currency we're talking about, those coins will be removed from circulation forever. Okay? It turns out that actually recovers ACO proofness. This actually prevents manipulation by cartels. Okay? So each time there's a new block created, there's going to be some reserve price, some minimum bid that a transaction has to bid to even be eligible to be executed. So the next question you should be asking me is like, oh, well, how do you know what that reserve price is supposed to be? And so it's really going to leverage the fact that we're not just doing a one-shot auction. It's the fact that we're going to use the fact that we're doing an auction every 12 seconds. And we're going to use the outcomes of previous auctions to inform the reserve prices of future ones. How are we going to do that? So here's the second big idea, which is to actually allow blocks to have variable size. Okay, so previously in Ethereum, there was just a hard cap. Let's call it 200 transactions. Now, that's going to be a soft constraint instead of a hard constraint. So there will still be a target of, on average, 200 transactions per block, but you're allowed to go over if you want. For technical reasons, you probably still want some hard cap. So let's say you can go up to 400 if you want, but the target is 200 per block. Now, you can run local search on your reserve price using the sizes of the recent blocks. The last block has 300 transactions. On your target, I guess you're selling block space too cheaply. The reserve price is too small, you should increase it. If the last block has only 100 transactions in it, I guess you've set it too high. Not that many people are willing to pay it, so you should lower it. So you use the sequence of block sizes to run local search to target 200 transactions per block. Finally, there's sort of an emergency backup first price auction embedded in it. So as a user, you have to pay the reserve price or the base fee. There's nothing you can do about it. You can optionally pay more. Anything you pay above and beyond the reserve price does get transferred to the block producer, just like bids do in the first price auction. So you should think of this as kind of an emergency backup first price auction that's sort of embedded into the mechanism. Yeah.
Can the block producer not burn the fee, but just take it for themselves?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the question was about sort of how does this burning happen, by the way. And that's actually a very important point here, which is, traditional mechanism design, you rarely see burning. Or if you see burning, it's kind of a metaphor, right? So traditional mechanism design, burning might just mean like, imagine a mechanism where you sell everything really cheaply and people have to camp out overnight to sort of be one of the first 100 people. They're all wasting their time. And that's burnt in the sense that nobody else gets the lost 24 hours all of those people suffer. Which is different than money, right? You pay someone $100, you lose the $100, but they gain the $100, right? You waste time, nobody else gets extra time for that purposes. Here it's actually burning in the literal sense, right? Which you normally do not see in mechanism design. And the reason you can do this credibly is because it's the native currency of the blockchain protocol. By native, I mean sort of, ETH, the currency of the protocol. It only exists because the protocol created it. Ownership of that is tracked by the protocol itself, and it is also in a position to destroy it, and it's the only one in a position to destroy it. So it's programmatic, the burn. There's nothing anybody can do about it. It's literally just part of the code of the protocol. And that's really taking advantage of the power of having access to this native currency that you yourself control.
So a user who's making a bid about the reserve price, if they win, how much do they pay in this protocol?
They pay the total. So they pay the reserve price plus anything they
whatever they win. So it's like first.
That's right. And then it gets split. Like the reserve price amount of it gets burned, and the rest gets passed to the block producer. All right. So we now have our 3 incentive compatibility notions. Right. So DSIC, MMIC, and OCA proof. Manipulations by users, by block producers, and by cartels. We've got our proposed mechanism, EIP 1559. We can now assess formally how well that mechanism does on our 3 criteria. Okay. And I don't know if I'd give it an A+, but I'd definitely give it an A. It's definitely a Pareto improvement over first price auctions in the following sense. So first price auctions, it's easy to see that they meet the second 2 incentive compatibility notions. But again, first price auctions are about as untruthful as it gets. You never want to bid your true value in a first price auction. You always want to shade your bid. How much you want to shade, that depends on your competition, but you always want to shade your bid. EIP 1559 retains those exact 2 properties. It's kind of for less trivial reasons, but it does meet both of those properties. And there's a precise sense in which it's usually truthful. Okay? Whereas again, first price auctions are never truthful. What I mean is it's truthful except in a single edge case. That edge case is when you're coming out of a stable period of very low demand, so you have a very low reserve price, and then there's suddenly some massive demand shock. Suddenly demand for Ethereum block space gets way higher. Intuitively, you'd like to suddenly increase the reserve price to compensate, but you're running this local search algorithm and it only sort of moves things one step at a time, so there'll be a period of a few minutes where the reserve price is just way too low, and people will have to compete through that tipping mechanism. Okay, so whenever you have a sudden shift from low demand to high demand, you will have a transitory period where you will lose the truthfulness property. But what the theorem says is that's the only edge case you have to worry about. Unless that just happened, you're going to be truthful. It's the dominant strategy for people to bid their true value. Okay? So very satisfying you get this Pareto improvement. Also very satisfying that this is a mechanism I don't think you'd ever come up with unless you were very cognizant of the constraints of the blockchain setting. Right? First price auctions, you don't need a blockchain to come up with this mechanism. Right? There's other traditional domains where you would do this exact same thing. Here, you're really taking advantage of the fact that there's an auction every 12 seconds, using the past to inform the present, and you're also taking advantage of this programmatic burning of fees that you're able to do. And so to close the loop on this story, I don't want to presuppose anything about cause and effects, but it is true that in August 2021, Ethereum did indeed switch to EIP 1559, and it's been humming along happily ever since. I should say, if you're wondering, could you do even better? You should always ask that question as a researcher. Can you do even better? Like, get rid of that usually? There's a very nice paper from just a couple months ago by Hao Chung and Elaine Shi saying that the answer is no. So you do have a little bit of a compromise here, and provably you need a little compromise. Let me talk a little bit about consensus. Right, so we talked about this earlier. What does it actually mean to be ownerless? What it means literally is that actually there's thousands of nodes, hopefully, scattered all over the globe, staying in sync about the current state of this virtual machine. How do they stay in sync? They use something called a consensus protocol. Okay, that's the point of a consensus protocol. And it's a very classical topic. A lot of really important work in the 80s and 90s on consensus protocols. Turing Awards given out to Lamport and Liskov, for example. Why were people thinking about consensus in the 1980s, 30 years before there were blockchains? Well, there are a lot of good reasons. Right? I mean, something simple would just be like maybe, IBM has a database, they want to get access to some of their customers, they want a super high uptime, way higher than you'd get if you just had it on one server, so you replicate. Okay, maybe IBM just buys like 7 different servers as a copy of the database on each. You could tolerate 2 of them going down, and you use a consensus protocol to keep them all in sync with each other. That would be an old school application of consensus. That's very different than the vision of permissionless blockchains like, say, Bitcoin and Ethereum. Any of you could, immediately after this talk, go and sort of download some software and start running the Bitcoin protocol 14 years after it launched. You could literally do that this afternoon, it would be no problem. So if you're designing a consensus protocol that's going to be used in that way, you have to be prepared to have no idea who's running your protocol, not now, not 14 years from now. Okay? And it's sort of such a Wild West demanding setting, a priori, I don't think it's at all obvious that there should even exist consensus protocols with provable guarantees in a permissionless setting like this. What do I mean by provable guarantees? Well, the minimal requirements you usually want of a consensus protocol is you want consistency, which means that all of the nodes running it stay in sync. They don't disagree on what's happened in the past. That's consistency. And then you also want liveness, which just says as long as there's stuff to do, people do it. So transactions do eventually get processed. Okay. So I don't think it's a priori obvious that you should have any kind of consensus protocol with provable consistency and liveness in this permissionless setting. And in fact, if you want to think of a main result from the theoretical sense of the Bitcoin white paper, it is that actually there is. It's a possibility result for permissionless consensus. This is the Bitcoin protocol, it turns out, under strong but standard assumptions like on the communication network and on the fraction of the participation that's Byzantine, does have provable liveness and consistency. So Bitcoin shows that this design space is not empty. What we now know is actually the design space is quite rich, and it has very different looking inhabitants. And I don't want to do any kind of taxonomy here. All I want to do in this slide is show you two of them that look quite different from each other, and that make quite different design decisions, just to give you a sense, okay, that they don't all look like each other. So first example is just going to be Bitcoin. And for our purposes, two big ideas of Bitcoin. Okay, one is how do you do this random sampling? How do you pick the node that's going to sort of be able to get the privilege of proposing the next block? So that's something called proof of work. Again, it's not so important for us, the details here, but basically you pick a node with probability proportional to the computational power that they contribute to the protocol. Okay, so that's one way you can do this random sampling. And then also, among all the blocks of transactions that have been proposed, you need some rule to decide which one of them are actually confirmed. Okay, so which transactions count and which ones don't. And the approach in the Bitcoin protocol famously is the longest chain rule. So you embrace the idea of forks, you embrace the idea that different nodes running the protocol may propose blocks that have a common predecessor, so introducing a fork. And you just say, don't worry about it, just the longest chain is the only one that matters. Okay. So those are the two high-level design decisions I want to highlight. Let me talk about a second one that makes very different decisions on both of those 2 points. There's actually a lot of different deployed blockchain protocols I could use as an example. For concreteness, I'll use one of them, namely the protocol Algorithmal. It does both of these two things in a different way. Okay? It does the random sampling differently, using something called proof of stake rather than proof of work. So now you're choosing a node with probability proportional to their economic commitment, as expressed by locking up some funds in escrow on a contract on the blockchain protocol. So that's a different way of doing random sampling. And also it does not use the longest chain rule. Instead, it's much closer to the classic protocols of the 20th century, which basically makes sure you never have a fork. Okay, so there's no need to resolve forks, because you build the consensus protocol in a different way so that under standard assumptions, you can't have it. Okay? So 2 different protocols, permissionless consensus protocols, look pretty different. They also offer incomparable mathematical guarantees. As far as where am I going here, I want to understand, as a theoretician doing sort of foundations work, I want to understand to what extent do the mathematical guarantees that you want dictate the design decisions that you have to make. Okay, so that's where we're going. So I've given you some examples of design decisions. Now I'm giving you some examples of the kind of mathematical guarantees you might get, you might want. So again, the details here aren't super important. High level, I'm just going to talk about these 2 protocols along 2 dimensions, and they're going to be incomparable. Okay, so one will make a stronger assumption in one dimension and a weaker assumption in the other dimension. When you're designing consensus protocols, worrying about consistency and liveness, there's kind of 2 different types of attackers that you're worried about, 2 different things that can screw you up. First thing you're worried about is you can't just assume that every node running your protocol is doing it exactly as you intended. That would kind of trivialize the problem. Right, so maybe someone has a buggy version of the software. Maybe someone had a hardware failure or just sort of pulled out the plug. Maybe even there's a malicious actor who's trying to mess up your protocol. Okay. So the first kind of assumption, which intuitively you obviously need, is some lower bound on what fraction of the participation in the protocol is running the protocol as you intended. That's a necessary condition for the guarantees. The second thing you're worried about is the communication network. Because you're going to need to make some kinds of assumptions about when or whether various messages sent from one machine to another get delivered. So for the Bitcoin protocol, the bad news is that it makes a pretty strong assumption. It's a standard assumption, but it's also a strong assumption about the communication network, namely that every message has sort of guaranteed bounded delay. Okay, so there's going to be some known parameter delta, maybe it's 10 seconds or something, and the assumption is that any message anybody ever sends anyone is going to get there within delta time. Okay? That's a reasonable model of a communication network on a good day, like when it's functioning sort of normally. It's obviously a bad model if you're worried about network outages, denial of service attacks, and so on. So bad news about Bitcoin is this strong assumption about the network. The good news is it's a relatively weak assumption about the amount of honest participation. All you need is a strict majority. If 51% of the computational power being brought to the protocol is running it correctly, then you get your provable consistency and liveness in the synchronous model. Algorand, the good news is it makes much weaker assumptions about the communication model. It works in something known as the partially synchronous model, which basically just says you can also tolerate network outages and denial of service attacks. Okay, so that's good, we're happy about that. We're sad that you need to make stronger assumptions about what fraction of the participation is being done correctly. You need to assume 67% rather than 51%, okay, as it turns out. But under those assumptions, you gain the consistency and liveness. So I show you all this stuff, and I just want some theory to help make sense of all of this. Right? You've got all these different permissionless consensus protocols. They make these different decisions. They have these different guarantees. Let me impose some sort of order on how to think about this design space. And that's been the goal of a research agenda I've been doing with Andy Lewis-Pai, who's a professor at London School of Economics over the last several years. And again, we really are sort of starting from mathematical guarantees you might want, say consistency and liveness in the partially synchronous model, something like that. Start from the guarantees that you want, and then back out what design decisions that forces you into, which part of the design space you have to be working in. So for example, I'm going to state these at a high level. I'll give you a little bit more detail on the first one in a second. We can prove in a formal sense that the only reason Algorand has the guarantees that it has is because it is designed the way that it's designed. Meaning, for example, it is essential for Algorand to achieve its consistency and liveness guarantees. It is essential that it is a proof-of-stake protocol and not a proof-of-work protocol. You provably cannot replicate its guarantees in a proof-of-work setting. And so that'll tell you a little bit more about it. Similarly, you can prove formally that you could not switch Algorand to a longest chain rule and retain the consistency and liveness guarantees. They would break. It's absolutely crucial that it uses this other genre of consensus protocols built on the ones from the 20th century. Okay. So that's what I mean by to what extent do the mathematical properties dictate which part of the design space you have to be working in. I know this is kind of a little bit vague, so let me just give you a little bit more detail about the first one. So to make it more formal, obviously we need some kind of, the first thing Andy and I had to do was just come up with a model that allows you to talk about all the different exotic species of blockchain protocols you might care about. So it should accommodate proof of work, proof of stake, longest chain, BFT type, etc. There's a lot of details to that model. I'm not going to bore you with them, but there is one sort of key part of it I want to highlight. Okay? Which is in our model, we think about the execution of a blockchain protocol in conjunction with the notion of a resource pool, which at every moment in time specifies some kind of resource balance for the different nodes running the protocol. What's a resource balance? That's basically your participation power in the protocol. So it's a proof of work setting, your resource balance is just going to be the amount of computational power that you have. If it's a proof of stake setting, it's just going to be the amount of stake you have in escrow and staking contracts. Okay? So we have this notion of the blockchain protocol running in conjunction with a resource pool. And we didn't know this was going to happen a priori, but it turns out what's really important in the theoretical development is a distinction between two different types of resource pools. Okay? You can loosely associate the first of these with proof of stake and the second with proof of work. We never formally define that's not our definitions, but you can think of them as proxies of those two things. Size setting, what does that mean? That means if you look at the blockchain state, if you look at the current state of that virtual machine, you know everybody's resource balances automatically. That would be true for a proof of stake chain, right? Because literally you're just looking at how much stake people have locked up in some staking contract, which is on this public blockchain. So that's what sized means. You see the blockchain state, you automatically know what the resource balances are. Unsized means that's not true. You cannot actually deduce the resource balances by looking at the blockchain state. That would be true in a proof of work protocol, right? Like if half the Bitcoin miners suddenly turned off all of their ASICs, there would be no immediate reflection of that in the Bitcoin blockchain state. Okay? So that's what I mean by unsized resource pool. Turns out to make a really big difference which of those two they do. So here's a formalization of that idea that you can't get Algorand's guarantees with the proof of work protocol. Let's phrase it as an impossibility result, that there's no protocol satisfying three different properties. Okay? This middle property is going to be some kind of very weak liveness notion. So let's take 2 as a constraint. Okay, like you wouldn't want a protocol that just sort of stops working, even when things are going pretty well. And if you think of 2 as a constraint, then we're saying you have to choose between 1 and 3. What's 1? Operating in the unsized setting. Again, think of that as a proxy for proof of work. 3, consistency in the partially synchronous model, which is one of Algorand's guarantees. Okay? So Bitcoin chooses the first 2. It's a proof of work protocol. It has this sort of minimal liveness, and it doesn't have consistency with network outages and denied service attacks. Now, don't get me wrong. You can look at the Bitcoin protocol, and you can convince yourself very, very quickly that it's not going to be consistent in the partially synchronous model. Okay, that if you have a network partition, you're going to have these independent chains, a bunch of stuff's going to get rolled back. It's not hard. Okay? But the point of this theorem is this says, what are the fundamental drivers of that fact? Right? It's not that we're missing some simple tweak of Bitcoin that would fix the problem. It's being driven fundamentally by the fact that, first of all, it's a proof of work protocol, and second of all, that it just meets some very minimal liveness condition. Knowing only those 2 things and nothing else, you automatically know you're going to be losing consistency under network partitions. Okay. Algorand, meanwhile, does get consistency in the partially synchronous setting, but it's not unsized. It's a proof-of-stake protocol, and this is what I mean by it really needs to be a proof-of-stake protocol or somehow otherwise be a blockchain protocol running relative to a sized resource pool. So I want to say, not a lot, but a few minutes about proof systems. Okay? This is not actually something I've read research papers about myself, so I'm not going to be stating any of my own theorems. But it's maybe the best example of just the unreasonable importance that theoretical computer science is having kind of in this application domain. To those of you that are not trained as theoreticians, it's hard for me to overstate sort of how central the notion of a proof system is to those of us who do theoretical computer science for a living. What do I mean by a proof system? Well, the definition comes from the 80s, and I believe the original motivation was just to sort of understand the mysteries of the computational universe. And so really just ask the question, what, mathematically, is a proof? And your first thought, reasonable thought, would be, open a math book. There's a theorem, there's a proof, that's a proof. It's a bunch of statements, each one logically follows from the previous one. That's the NP notion of a proof. But let's sort of think a little bit more out of the box. Like, what if you have a teacher and a student? The teacher knows more and wants to teach the student about some fact, okay? Prove something to them in a sense. Well, they're going to interact, they're going to have a conversation. Maybe there's even sort of randomness. You can't predict a priori which questions the students are going to ask to clarify their understanding. And so the proof system sort of codifies that sense of a proof. Right? So when can you have a sort of powerful prover, like the teacher, a weak verifier, like the student? When can the prover convince the verifier that some fact is true? Okay? And this turns out to be a more general notion of proof than NP. Many of the deepest and most famous results from theoretical computer science are about proof systems. Zero knowledge for all of NP, the PCP theorem, IP equals P space, etc. And I don't know that anyone back in the 1980s was going to be anticipating that in 2023 there would be literally multi-billion-dollar startups where all they do is try to make these proof systems practical. And actually, literally 2023 is probably going to be the year where it goes from theory to practice. And they're almost there. Specifically, it's going to be a type of proof system called a Snark. So let me just tell you a little bit about how this works. Okay? So we talked about transaction fee mechanisms. That was about the open access property of the computer in the sky. We wanted to make it economically viable, so we needed to have some way to figure out the most valuable transactions. We talked about consensus protocols. That was about the ownerless property of the computer in the sky. Right? We wanted to say, how do we sort of keep all these machines in sync on the virtual machine? Now we're going to talk about scaling. So now we're going to address the fact that like this computer in the sky, okay, it's sort of ownerless, that's great, open access, that's great, but it's only doing 15 transactions per second, and that's not good enough. How do we make it 15,000 transactions per second? Okay. And there's a lot of competing approaches to that. I'm going to tell you about one of them. Well, the idea here is to graft in external computation, okay, that's outside of sort of the main consensus protocol. And just like the simplest version of this, just imagine there's some individual who's just like a really big fan Ethereum. They love Ethereum, they want to see it take over the world. And they happen to own a massive computer, right? And so they're like, hey, Ethereum, let me take some load off your shoulders. I can actually process 10,000 transactions per second. I'll just do that and give you periodic updates about what I've been up to. That's the high-level idea. Now you think about this, right? And if we can make this work, this would be great, right? So users will still have the option of submitting directly to the old blockchain protocol like Ethereum. Computation is scarce, so this is probably going to be expensive. But if this person is sort of online and available, you'll have a second additional option where to use this abundant computation, which should be cheap. But if you think about these periodic updates, right? The main blockchain can't just take them on faith, right? It can't just say like, oh, thanks for letting me know the new state of the virtual machine. Because for all we know, this off-chain computer, it's going to be like, hey, Ethereum, these are the 10,000 transactions that executed. By the way, all the coins are now mine. Right? You can't just let it get away with that. So the updates need to be verifiable. They need to be verifiable by the main blockchain, by Ethereum. Okay? And I hope the proof system metaphor is now becoming clear. Okay? Who is the teacher? Who's the person with more knowledge and more power? That is the off-chain computer. Who is the student? Who is the verifier that does not have much knowledge or computation? That is the slow computer in the sky. That would be like the main blockchain. Okay. So that's the question. Can you have the powerful computer convince the weak computer that its computations are done correctly? It actually turns out there's a specific type of proof system known as Snark, which is exactly what you want to make this work. Okay. It's exactly the right tool to get this scaling roadmap to be viable. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but just I feel I owe you an explanation of the acronym if you haven't seen it before. So the S stands for succinct, and this just means basically that the main blockchain should be able to sort of verify correctness without having to redo all the computation from scratch. Okay, so it should really be the case you're taking some load off of, say, Ethereum shoulders. That's what succinct means. We talked about how proof systems in general are interactive, they're a conversation. If you think about permissionless blockchain protocols where like people come and go and you might just show up 14 years from now, like the person you want to have a conversation with might not be around anymore. So the N is for non-interactive. You just really want a one and done post-proof that's just recorded on the blockchain forevermore. Argument basically just says it's a proof. So like if you do your computations correctly, then you can convince the main blockchain you've done so. If you haven't done them correctly, you can't convince the main blockchain you've done so. Knowledge is also important in a Web3 context, but not as important as the first three. So let me skip that. And then this is the final thing I'll say. Right? So one kind of, I think, subconscious theme running through this talk is, those of us who do theory for a living, one of the things we really love about it, which is if you really distill the essence of some computational challenge, and you get the definitions right, okay? More often than not, those will turn out to be exactly the definitions you need 40 years later for some application domain you could never have envisioned. Okay? That was definitely true in our consensus discussion, right? Again, all of those traditional protocols were developed in the 1980s and 90s. That's when they defined the partially synchronous model. That's when they sort of emphasized consistency and liveness. All of those concepts are exactly what you need to talk about permissionless consensus. You need more stuff too, but that's exactly the right foundations to build from. Here again, right, proof systems being studied purely for intellectual reasons, understand the nature of proofs. Snark's also a special case of a proof system, invented 15 years before Bitcoin, okay? Initially as a consequence of the PCP theorem. And yet somehow it's exactly what we need, okay, for scaling Ethereum. Not only that, and maybe this is not surprising, but it's still interesting. Like if you look at once people realize Snarks exist, right, what do theorists do? They start trying to beat down kind of functions to being slower and slower functions of some parameter, right? And so that's what people did with Snarks. And so what objective functions did you want to care about? Well, naturally, theorists focused on the work involved for the prover, the work involved for the verifier, the size of the proof, all that kind of stuff. These are actually, if you care about sort of practical viability of scaling up Ethereum, these are exactly the metrics you care about. They're exactly right. They're exactly what you want to obsess over for decades. Length of the proof, that translates to storage on the computer in the sky. Storage is expensive because it's scarce. Verification time, that's computation on the computer in the sky. Again, scarce, again, expensive. Prover time, well, this is what's going to limit the extent to which you can craft in this off-chain computer, right? If it's n to the 10 time to generate a proof for n transactions, you're not going to be able to help out Ethereum very much just because you won't have time to compute the proof yourself. And so, and a lot of the sort of startups that I talked about, they're now even sort of manufacturing their own ASICs just to get this prover time as small as possible. Which again, I don't think is what I was thinking of back in the mid-80s. So that's all I've got. Again, to wrap up. Mental model for blockchains and Web3. It's a computer in the sky, it's open access, it has no owner. Its fundamental capability is to enable private property in the digital realm. Despite having no owner, it enables meaningful ownership by end users of data stored on that computer. And we saw how all of those characteristics of the computer in the sky lead to really interesting computer science. To make it economically viable and yet open access, we needed a good transaction fee mechanism. Ownerless really means you get a permissionless consensus protocol. And again, we talked about how scaling proof systems is one of the leading approaches for how that's going to happen. So let me stop there. Thanks very much.
Let's open it up for questions. So thank you for a great talk. My question is about transaction keys. I'm wondering what kind of assumptions did you make about the transactions? Are they drawn from some distribution and they go away if you don't satisfy them? Also, do you make assumptions about people's budget? Can I wait for someone else to run out of their budget so that I can bring the price down?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Let me kind of answer it in the following way. So you're pointing out something, which is a very appropriate comment, which if you look back at my set of compatibility notions, the new ones that we talked about, that we made a big deal about, so one of the M's in MMIC is for myopia, by which I mean I'm thinking of a block producer that's only thinking at the time scale of a single block. Okay? Similarly for OCA proofness, I'm thinking about a cartel that's only reasoning about what they want to do in the next 12 seconds. They're deliberately not thinking about long-range strategies. Similarly for users, I'm envisioning them sort of showing up, they either get in or they get out, and then they go away. Okay, so it's sort of like one shot. Obviously, reality is more like what you said. People will have some kind of two-dimensional utility function at least, with money being one dimension and the waiting time another dimension. There are a couple, at least there's sort of one nice economics paper that thinks about Bitcoin specifically in that kind of model, which I can tell you about afterwards. Here, that's just a very natural sort of direction to take this work. So I definitely, there was kind of enough to do in the single time slot case to get right that I just wanted to start there. But I would love to have someone follow up in the directions that you said. Okay.
So I want to ask your 10-year perspective of like blockchain industry in general. Do you see it to still do something like DeFi centered, I don't know, Web3 thing, or do you see some kind of integrations with like fundamental like structures like replacing outdated banking software, or like we seeing like trading options like for Google ads, I don't know, like in other options in banking system, or like sending our houses on, I don't know, this kind of problems.
So the question is basically about the application layer. I mean, I don't like predictions in general, and especially don't like predictions in areas where it's not my core talent. And so I would say the application layer has that quality. So I don't want to, I've been in many conversations about it, so I can tell you what I've synthesized from all of the discussions I've had with lots of different people. But, right, so I say there's both short-term and long-term. Okay, so short-term, I think for possessions that naturally already live in the digital world, I think, those were even in the coming years, we're going to see sort of major changes. Like we're already starting to see social media platforms where you own your account in the sense that it's secured by Ethereum, compared to like Twitter, which can delete your account and does frequently. Just delete your account whenever you want. Right? We're seeing things like video games where when you buy skins in those games, the games are actually stored on Ethereum. Right? So even if that sort of game goes away, you still own those skins. For example, some other platform could be built that then sort of gives you some different user experience using those same skins that you bought. Okay, so this idea that stuff that's already digital, it's already natively digital, right? But it's a possession, it's something either you created or that you bought, and you would like property rights commensurate with the stuff you've created and bought in the physical world. All of that stuff I think is definitely this decade. I mean, in some sense it's already happening now. A second phase is some of the other applications you mentioned, which is like, well, what about digital representations of things that are fundamentally in the physical world? Okay. I also don't see any fundamental barrier for not making tons of inroads there. There, I think it's more of a decades-long timeline, probably, just because sort of traditional institutions, big businesses, all those things, they just move slowly, right? And we saw this with the internet, right? I mean, lots of big companies were kind of slow to use it in sort of obvious ways. So that, so then there's a separate suite of applications where you actually need buy-in from, just standard institutions. I don't see why that wouldn't happen, but I also won't be, I would not be shocked if it's not happening that much in 2030. Whereas 2040, the hope would be a lot of the happening.
I have one question regarding the powerful computer and the cloud computer.
Yep.
The way their verification works. How frequent is it? Is the frequency dependent on the size of the loss?
How frequent are the updates?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of, so this thing is often called a L2 or a layer 2. Sometimes it's just all referred to as a roll-up design. And different roll-ups just, I mean, in some ways best practices have not converged, and different projects are doing different frequency updates. Because there's a couple of things, I mean, in some sense you'd love to just do it every single block. In some sense that's what you'd like. What are the problems with that? Well, first of all, you have to pay, layer 1 gas costs then if you're posting a proof every block, so that's sort of, it's costly. The second thing is that if you think about the prover time, often you kind of want to wait to have a sufficiently big batch of transactions so that the amortized prover time is sort of sufficiently small. Right? So if the prover time is growing sublinearly in the number of transactions you're proving, then you kind of want to wait around a while to get big batches to sort of do well on the prover time side. So it varies. I mean, some are definitely only like in the hours. Some, I believe, are in the minutes. I think those are the kinds of machines. I mean, Ethereum blocks are every 12 seconds, right? So if there's like every 100 blocks, right, that'd be what, 1,200 seconds, so that's like 20 minutes or something like that, right? So like, that would probably be on the more frequent side. So it's a range, and we don't really have any principles guiding us about what it should be.
So regarding these Snarks, I just want to ask, where do you exactly keep the state? Like you said, okay, the blockchain will just do the proof, but where do you do the update?
Yeah, so there's different ways you could do it, but the simplest way you would do it is that actually layer 2 would have its own state.
Okay.
So you would actually open an account, maybe using the same public key, but you would open an account on the layer 2, your assets would be on the layer 2, and then the layer 2 would be basically giving very succinct summaries to L1 about what the state is, right? And it's going to be the minimal amount, sort of subject to, if this thing went down, you could actually reconstruct, maybe with days of computation, but you could in practice reconstruct what the layer 2 state was when it went down. So think of it as like checkpoints for this thing's state, actually. Now, from a UX perspective, it is, at least the vision is it would be more like what I talked about. Like it should look exactly the same as before, it's just that the transaction throughput went up by sort of 1000x, right? You should be using some wallet, it should be just disguised from you. It should be handling where your assets are and sort of, but eventually that's where we need to get to, where people maybe don't even know they're on a blockchain at all, let alone know which blockchain that they have to be using. So, yeah.
I get a bit of intuition about cheap versus expensive transactions. Sort of the protocols that you originally showed us, sort of the forking. How would that play with the off-chain computation? And then
actually, that's a good question. That's so I get really deep questions in these talks sometimes. Let's see. So this picture. So you're absolutely right to point out that somehow, if you're thinking about posting these verifiable updates, like this feels much more comfortable, right? Because it's just like, oh, well, it showed up in block 5, I guess that's what it was. I'm not worried that there's going to be some other block 5, because there's no forks in these kinds of protocols. So with longest, like if you're actually coupling a rollup with a longest chain protocol, you actually have to worry about reorganizations. So the question is more kind of like, so the question is more like, suppose you do a transaction on layer 2, right? When will you consider it confirmed, right? So suppose someone sends you money for some physical good that you're going to give up, okay? They're buying a laptop from you for $1,000 or whatever. But they say, look, right, on Polygon or whatever, Arbitrum, like, here's my payment to you for $1,000, right? And you say like, okay, well, it's only in the mempool, so I'm not gonna give you my laptop yet. No, look, it's in this block that's sort of up there, right? And if it's here, you're like, oh, you're right, okay, that's in B5, cool. Like, I know that's not gonna be reverted, here's my laptop. If it's up here, if it's in like, B4 prime or B5, you're kind of like, hold on, let's wait a little while. I'll give you my laptop once like the block is, whatever, 200 deep in the longest chain. And so it's sort of so you're absolutely right, the longest chain does sort of complicate the roll-up story, they don't play quite as nicely together because you have to have this sort of big delay because of the potential reorganization.
Go near the slide on roll-ups.
Which one?
The one on roll-ups. Yeah, so here. So just conceptually, what's the difference between like this L2 concept and sharding? And just like dividing the address space?
Yeah, it's a fair question. Basically, this is kind of a logically, you can imagine different versions of this. Like, for example, bridges between blockchains. It's kind of like a two-sided version of this in some way, right? But so the story I told here, basically, the L2 depends on the L1. So it's an asymmetric relationship, right? So in some sense, the reason that people maybe feel comfortable using this layer 2, right? This is just some guy running his computer, right? Like, you don't know what's going to happen to this guy. It might go away, right? But the reason you're still willing to use it is because let's say you do trust that Ethereum is going to be around for a long time, and then the way the system's built, sufficient sort of breadcrumbs are left on Ethereum to be able to reconstruct kind of your assets on layer 2, basically. So I'm trying to remember what your question was.
The difference is sharding.
Sharding. Yeah, so there's different types of sharding. So one type of sharding is really about data, right? So that I'm not even sort of addressing here so much. Another one is about sharding the execution. Yeah, but you notice you don't need to talk both directions, right? So this is just kind of like a unilateral, there's really just two parties. There's only one direction you need to communicate. Like this, like you gotta remember, this person doesn't even basically acknowledge this person's existence. They have no idea who this person is. Yes, this person deployed a smart contract over here, and this person is sort of injecting transactions over here to update that smart contract and sort of state this and so on. But like, it's not, they're not aware of each other the way you need two shards of a common bunch of protocol to be aware of each other to communicate. So this is simpler, I would say. Yeah.
I was kind of curious about the incentives for having the layer 2, because you started out with the example that the layer 2 person cares a lot about Ethereum, but if they have all this compute, they could just contribute that to the overall blockchain. So I guess my inference I'm drawing is that layer 2 is kind of selfish. Like, if you want to make your transactions faster, then run a layer 2 with all your compute, instead of just everyone gives their compute to the main blockchain and makes that one fast.
Okay, so I guess I want to separate the incentives for users versus the incentives for the providers. So which did you want to focus on?
Users, I guess.
The user, so from the user perspective, like in the simple version of it, basically you have a menu of two options, right? You basically have like cheaper price, stronger trust assumptions, higher price, lower trust assumptions. And it's just your choice.
Yeah.
Right? And that's what it's about. It's just saying like, you have all these different options. I'm not going to dictate, you're not locked into sort of one way of doing it. From the provider perspective, it's just, they're just sort of, I don't know what to say. It's almost just, they're just different, like you said. It's not so simple as like literally you just unplug your machine here and replug it here, I guess, right? So I'd have to think a while about all the trade-offs, right? So for this, to do this, you in particular kind of need to have this kind of, you need to have provers, you need to be able to generate snarks. Like this is kind of like a major endeavor, actually. Like this is basically a startup company if you want to do this, right? Whereas you can be a validator in Ethereum just as a solo person. It's getting sort of harder as the time goes on, but still, like University of Waterloo computer science undergrads could definitely like figure out how to just, if someone lent you the 32 ETH, you definitely could just sort of run a validator like starting later today or later this week, basically. So I don't really know. So they're very different. It's kind of saying like, should you spend your next few years of your life kind of doing a startup or kind of getting a degree and just doing this hobbyist thing on the side.
They collect fees or anything?
You're saying about the business model?
Yeah.
Well, that's another thing. Is like, what's the business model, right? So here you're getting the transaction fees. Well, this could get really complicated really quickly. But I mean, in both cases, you have various sources of revenue, right? And so, which one's going to be higher? Who knows, right? Yeah, in the back.
So what's the purpose of setting the reserve price if it's going to get burned down by
So the whole point of the EATCS-SIGACT, the whole initial point was to make it as trivial as possible for people to figure out what to bid. With the gold standard being shopping on Amazon, right? You load up, you look at some textbook on Amazon, it's $40, take it, right? And like the point is, that's like really easy, and you'll never regret it. You'll never look, unless you look back and you say I should have had a higher value for it, but like you won't look back and be like, darn, I should have bid 35. No, it was like $40, take it or leave it, right? So that's sort of the gold standard you're going for here. And so under normal conditions, so outside of that one edge case I mentioned, in fact, that transaction fee mechanism is like shopping on Amazon. And this reserve price literally is just this sort of price, take it or leave it. If you're willing to pay it, you're in. If you're not, you're out. And so it's really originally comes from a UX perspective. Although there's a lot of other interesting consequences of wanting that sort of UX advancement as we saw.
So this might be against the spirit of Ethereum-like protocol, but suppose countries come together, UN comes together and says blockchain is super important. We are going to add this additional centrally owned thing. What can they do? Like, are there incentives are there things that they could do to make things more efficient? So I'm coming through the lens of, there's still something decentralized that's running. Are there like price of anarchy type of sort of considerations you could have that if there was a central authority that we trusted, then there's certain things would be a lot more smoother, and then maybe the governments come together and say,
yeah, so I mean, in general, there is some amount, and people argue about how much, but it seems clear that there's some fundamental tension between performance and decentralization. Now, both of those two words are really loaded words and mean different things to different people, so I want to be careful about it, but there clearly is some continuum, right? And I think a lot of discussion makes it sound like a binary thing, like you're either centralized or you're decentralized. And I think that's completely helpful. I think really just, if you just kind of want to, so what's the best way to say this? So I do sort of expect kind of blockchain protocols to pop up that are kind of run by governments or companies that are closely controlled by governments. They can't sort of stop Ethereum, right? But they can try to come up with competitors to Ethereum, which are less permissionless, maybe a lot less permissionless, but potentially higher performance. And then the market would basically decide what happens. Yeah, so Ethereum, I think of Ethereum as kind of, it's really not a priori obvious you shouldn't be able to get this far with the relatively strong permissionless guarantees that they have, right? And so it's kind of always, I think, going forward going to be on that end of the spectrum. Maybe you could argue Bitcoin's even further on that end of the spectrum. But Ethereum, I think, will always be one of your kind of lowest trust options, basically. And then whether that's something you care about, that's again the sort of consumer end user.
Yeah, so we have an online question. Somebody's asking about sustainability in terms of energy budgets and these kinds of things. So is it worth doing this at all?
Yeah. So right. So this is really a question about Bitcoin specifically, right? So Bitcoin, as we discussed, uses proof of work, civil resistant random sampling. The reason for the energy consumption of the Bitcoin protocol is because it uses proof of work and nothing else. There's no other reason why it uses proof of work. The other thing to know is that every other major blockchain protocol at this point is not proof of work. Ethereum actually just even switched over to proof of stake in August, 6 months ago or so. So that's the first thing to say, right? So it's not really a criticism of this technology, it's a criticism specifically about proof of work, which in practice means it's a criticism of Bitcoin. People like to argue, and so what's the way to say this? If someone wants to say like we should find a way to shut Bitcoin down because it's unacceptable, the kind of effects on the climate, Not everyone's going to agree with that, but I think that's a logically coherent sort of position. Right? I think there are other logically coherent positions as well, but I think I understand someone who had that opinion that Bitcoin, they would prefer that it not exist. Blockchain technology broadly, again, that's not what the criticism is about. So something like modern day Ethereum, it uses as much energy as like the HTTP protocol. It's just like any other Web 1 protocol. And it's not something where we would generally rise to the level where we'd be concerned about the energy consumption. So that's the number one point I'll ever want to take from that question.
Yeah. So I'm going to go back to my question about the dynamic. First of all, like, what is the intuition for first price auction to be incentive compatible? Like, I'm having a hard time to figure out what's the intuition for this setting for people to, truthfully bid. Second, if we look at that dynamic that you laid out, is it possible for the cartel to come and make people increase their demands, or just put a lot of demands into the block so that the price hikes? Now, in the transitioning, they start using that usually truthful property to gain. So basically, the cartel makes that jump to happen, and then in that transitioning period, they bet by not truthfully bid them.
Yeah, so let's see. So you're talking about the 50-59, not first price auctions, right? Yeah. So a couple things. So one, again, the analysis I described is not about long-term strategies. If you go to so I have a research paper on that work. I also have just kind of a longer report for the general public, 58 pages. In the long report, I have a section that does discuss long-range strategies, though there's no theorems, so it's more a qualitative discussion. And I talk about a lot of strategies of the sort of nature that you say, where you kind of do things in the short term to mess stuff up and try to cash in later. And again, I don't have theorems, but like the conclusion of my analysis was that, while in principle possible, it seems to require a degree of coordination, which historically has not been sustainable. Like, one thing to realize is just even a first price auction, if sort of block producers coordinate, they can manipulate it also, right? So something you might want to do is not actually fill up blocks, but fill up blocks only halfway to sort of boost the price that people are going to pay for them, right? So that's something you can do right now in Bitcoin, you can do right now, like in old Ethereum, whatever. And people don't seem to do that for whatever reason. And the report speculates on some of the reasons why that might be true. So given that you don't see that kind of manipulation of first price auctions when it's even more straightforward to do it there, I'm not making a prediction, but I don't see any obvious reason why that would suddenly now happen with this different transaction fee mechanism. Again, that's not fully satisfying, but if you want my thoughts on it, there's literally like 8 pages or something that report about it.
So my
let's go to the different. Maybe we can come back later, but yeah.
Didn't you have a question?
Yeah, I did. So I was just wondering if you could speak a little more about, obviously, we've been dancing around this the whole time, is the fact that doing these blockchain transactions are just like so expensive. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about like why that bottleneck is there, and kind of like, if there's anything that people are trying to do to prevent that or to just like improve that bottleneck, and what happens to all of these other procedures and all of this theory that's been developed, in a world where those transactions become a lot less expensive.
Yeah, that's a good question. So a couple of things. So first of all, like whether it's expensive or not depends on the blockchain we're talking about, right? So like in Solana, they're going to be a lot cheaper than on Ethereum, for example. I think we'd like to get to a world where there's some nominal transaction fee for every transaction. Like you want some amount just for sort of spam fighting, but like maybe it's a penny transaction or a tenth of a penny, I'm not sure what, something like that. And in some sense, like the whole reason, there's different ways of thinking about it, but like there's an immediate economic consequence of scaling capacity like we were talking about, right? If you remember Econ 101, like supply-demand curves, right? If you just kind of like move the supply curve in the right direction, then the sort of clearing price sort of drops, right? So that's what's good. It's always a little tricky because it's like maybe, okay, well now all of a sudden like it's so cheap, people come up with all these new applications, and then demand goes up. You do get this sort of like cycles of evolution, but in some sense the scaling story is exactly like one way to talk about it is how do we get the transactions per second high. A roughly equivalent way of thinking about it is how do we get the cost per transaction low. Right, so I sort of think of that as rolled up into this. I love the way you phrased your question, and I try to, because a lot of people I talk to that are building things, they really are sort of in this little rabbit hole of like writing solidity smart contracts and trying to save every possible unit of gas that they can. And I get why they're doing that. That may be a good use of their time right now. But if all of this technology really succeeds, there will be a point at which you do not have to be so careful with sort of gas usage. And also and for people who are thinking about developing applications, and I often ask them this, what would you do if gas was free? Right, I'd give you a blockchain and gas is free. What would you build then? And I actually think that's the right question to ask, basically. It depends on your time frame, but like, if you want to think on the 5 to 10 year time frame, I think that's the question to ask.
One more question, maybe?
So could you give like a really brief, maybe intuition or explanation of what a proof looks like in this interaction?
Yes. So it's based on, fundamentally it's based on probabilistic checking. So I don't know if you've ever seen anything like, I don't know if you take randomized algorithms or something like that, but there's this idea that like, there are certain, so the first thing to notice is that there are certain computations where it's actually pretty easy to probabilistically check if they were done correctly. Right? So people talk about like matrix multiplication, this kind of stuff, and you do like, you take random bits and do an inner product and this kind of stuff. So the first realization, which dates back at least to the 70s, is that there are certain computations where, if you're willing to accept 1% error, like being wrong 1% of the time, it's actually quite easy to prove someone that they verified much faster than you did the computation. Now, much less obvious is whether actually arbitrary computations can be made probabilistically checkable in that way. But that's actually exactly the content of the PCB theorem, conceptually at least, from 1992. And then the 1994 construction of Snarks, that was really saying like, oh, well, given that we can do like this sort of probabilistic checking of arbitrary computations, now we can have a Snark where we just kind of like write down the random bits that we used and the results. Now, there's this sort of confusing thing where it's like, well, what do you mean write down the random bits? Like, how do I know you flipped your coins correctly? Maybe you just sort of flipped your coins in a way that's sort of to trick me. Right? And so then you get into something known as like the Fiat-Shamir heuristic. We use sort of a cryptographic hash function to sort of generate the random bits that you then use. And so that's sort of what the Snark looks like. It says, look, here are the pseudo-random bits that I'm using, and the input that I fed through the cryptographic hash function to generate them. Here are the kind of the probabilistic tests that then implied, and here are the results of those tests, which all check out. Right? And so then you read all that stuff, and you're like, okay, cool. And so why do you get succinctness? Like, go back to the PCB theorem, right? You start from like a SAT formula of like n or something like that. Then you turn it into this probabilistically checkable version, which is like a little bigger. And then you might ask just even like 3 random queries, and that gives you sort of a 50% correctness rate. And then if you amplify it, so then if you ask 30 queries, right? I think 30 is a constant here, independent of the size n of the formula. Right, so this is where the succinctness comes from. The amount of interaction you're doing is independent of how long the formula you started with. And so that's why you get these kinds of
So let's give 2 minutes